It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing Friday night, the kind where you unwind after a long week, surrounded by nothing but comfort and familiarity. My husband, Chris, and I were lounging around at home, sipping wine and chatting about random things, enjoying each other's company. It felt like one of those perfect, cozy nights where nothing unusual would happen. But then, out of nowhere, Chris casually asked me a question that threw me completely off balance. Have you ever thought about being with other men? At first, I thought he was joking, so I laughed it off. But then he continued. It wasn't just any question. He was talking specifically about being with 3 men, and he was dead serious. I stared at him, trying to gauge if this was some kind of twisted joke, but his expression was unshaken, almost too calm. I felt my heart race, but not with excitement, more like a warning. I didn't know how to respond. Who just casually suggests something like that? I tried to brush it off, thinking it was some weird fantasy, something we'd laugh about and move on from. But no, he kept bringing it up. At first, it was little comments, playful teasing about how it might spice up our relationship. But the suggestions grew bolder. He spoke about it like it would be a one-time thing, something that would add excitement to our lives. I couldn't figure out how to react. Was I supposed to say yes? Was this some kind of test? It felt like I was trapped between keeping the peace and standing my ground. As days passed, Chris wouldn't drop it. He kept bringing it up, mentioning his friends, 3 men who were cool and would respect my boundaries. It felt like he was trying to sell me on the idea, making it sound harmless. But the more he talked, the more uncomfortable I became. I didn't know how to tell him how deeply disturbed I was without causing an argument. Then, one evening, things escalated. Chris suggested we meet these 3 men. He framed it like it was no big deal, just a casual hangout with his friends. I hesitated, unsure if he was pushing me into something I wasn't ready for. But in an effort to avoid an argument, I reluctantly agreed. We met them at a local bar, and I immediately felt out of place. His friends were polite, charming even, but there was an underlying tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into something I couldn't control. As the night went on, I grew more uneasy. Chris was completely at ease, like he was enjoying the attention I was getting from his friends. Every time one of them looked at me, it felt like a silent agreement passed between them. I wanted to get out of there. When we all ended up back at our house, I could feel the shift in the air. It was no longer casual. Chris seemed to enjoy watching me squirm, like this was some kind of game. I tried to keep busy in the kitchen, hoping to avoid whatever was unfolding in the living room. But one of his friends followed me in, and that's when I realized I was no longer in control. He stood too close, his presence too heavy, and suddenly the air felt suffocating. He leaned in, his breath too close to my ear. And then, in a voice that made my skin crawl, he whispered, "You look like you want this." That was the moment everything shifted. My heart raced with a mix of anger, fear, and disbelief. I backed away, bumping into the counter behind me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I looked toward the doorway, hoping Chris would sense something was wrong, but there was no sign of him. I realized then that he wasn't going to intervene. He was the one who put me in this position to begin with. I felt trapped, but at that moment, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just a bad idea gone too far. This was something deeper, and I had to find a way to stop it before it destroyed everything. I was on my own now, the weight of the situation hitting me all at once. I pushed past the guy in the kitchen and made my way into the living room, where the other 2 men were still laughing with Chris, completely oblivious to the panic swirling inside me. Chris glanced at me, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, but there was no recognition of the turmoil inside me. Maybe he did know and just didn't care. At that moment, I couldn't tell anymore. I sat down on the edge of the couch, gripping the cushion so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My mind replayed the scene in the kitchen over and over. The way I'd felt cornered, trapped, like I was about to lose control of the situation. It terrified me. But more than that, it angered me. How could Chris push me into something like that? How could he be so casual about it? As if my feelings didn't matter. The night seemed to drag on, each moment heavier than the last. The men kept drinking, laughing, and Chris continued to play along as if everything was perfectly fine. But nothing about this was fine. I kept thinking about the kitchen, about how close I'd come to crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. It scared me, and it made me furious. But the worst part? I couldn't say anything. I couldn't find the words to express how violated I felt, how uncomfortable this whole thing had made me. Finally, the guys got up to leave. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. For the first time that night, I could finally breathe. But as they walked out the door, I knew the tension wasn't really gone. It lingered, simmering just beneath the surface, a quiet storm threatening to break. After they left, I turned to Chris. He was still smiling, like he'd just hosted the best night ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to say something. "What was that?" My voice trembled, but I couldn't stop it. Chris looked at me, genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" I motioned toward the door where his friends had just left. "That whole thing, what were you thinking?" He shrugged, his casual demeanor only making me angrier. "It was just a bit of fun. You didn't have to do anything you didn't want to." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Fun?" My voice rose. "You call that fun? You put me in a situation where one of your friends was all over me, and you just sat there like it was no big deal?" For the first time that night, I saw a flicker of realization in his eyes, but instead of apologizing, he got defensive. "I thought you were into it. You didn't say anything. You didn't stop him." That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I wasn't sure if I was more angry or hurt. Do you have any idea how uncomfortable that was for me? How trapped I felt? I thought you were supposed to protect me, not put me in situations like that. The room fell silent. Chris didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at me as if he didn't know what to do. After what felt like an eternity, he muttered a weak apology, but it didn't feel like enough. It didn't feel like he really understood what he'd done. That night, I couldn't stay in our bed. I needed space. Time to think. I slept in the guest room, wrestling with everything that had happened and what it meant for our relationship. I loved Chris, but something had changed between us. The trust I'd once felt was shattered. He'd pushed me into a situation I wasn't ready for, and I didn't know if I could forgive him for that. Looking back, I realized that it wasn't just about that night. It was about trust, about feeling safe, respected, and valued in a relationship. My husband had crossed a line, and now I had to decide if I could ever feel comfortable with him again.